Go ahead, laugh. It's just cake, right? The words hadn't even finished echoing when the white frosting hit her face, soft but loud in its own way, the kind of impact that didn't need force to command a room. Because humiliation, when delivered in silk and crystal, always carried farther than sound. For half a second, no one moved. Then the laughter came, light at first, polite, like people testing whether it was safe to find it funny, and then louder, fuller, spilling across the long marble table lined with imported glassware and gold-trimmed plates. The chandeliers above shimmered, scattering warm light across tailored suits and diamond necklaces, reflecting off the untouched champagne flutes that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Ava Brooks didn't flinch. The frosting slid slowly down her cheek, cool against her skin, a thin line tracing the curve of her jaw before falling, one drop at a time, onto the polished white floor beneath her heels. She didn't reach for a napkin. Not yet. Her hands remained still at her sides, fingers relaxed, posture straight, as if the moment hadn't landed on her at all, but somewhere, just inches away. Across from her, Ethan Caldwell leaned back in his chair, barely 17, smirking with the careless confidence of someone who had never been told no and never had to wonder what it cost to say yes. "It's just a joke," he said, shrugging, his voice carrying easily over the hum of amused conversation, as if the room itself existed to echo him. His mother, Margaret Caldwell, covered her mouth with a manicured hand, her laughter quieter but no less approving, while his father, Richard Caldwell, swirled the amber liquid in his glass and shook his head with a smile that suggested indulgence rather than correction. No one stood. No one objected. A few guests glanced at Ava, then quickly looked away, their discomfort dissolving into the safety of silence. The air shifted, not with tension, but with something thinner, more fragile. The unspoken agreement that this was acceptable, that this was how power behaved when it believed itself untouchable. Ava's gaze moved slowly across the table, not searching for support, not expecting it, just observing, cataloging, absorbing every detail the way she always had, the way she learned to survive rooms like this long before she ever owned them. The faint scent of vanilla frosting mixed with expensive cologne, the soft clink of ice against crystal, the distant hum of city traffic 30 floors below, muted by glass so thick it turned the outside world into something decorative, distant, irrelevant. Another drop of frosting fell, breaking the perfect reflection on the marble floor. Still, she didn't move. Not yet, because sometimes the most powerful thing in a room wasn't the one who spoke first. It was the one who chose when to. And in that suspended moment, with laughter still lingering and no one noticing the quiet shift settling beneath it, Ava Brooks simply stood there, letting the silence begin to form around her like something inevitable. The frosting finally stopped moving, settling into a thin, uneven line along Ava Brooks's cheek as the laughter around her softened into scattered murmurs, the kind that lingered only because no one had yet decided to end them. She let the silence stretch just a fraction longer, then slowly, deliberately, she lifted her hand. Not rushed, not embarrassed. Her fingers brushed the edge of the frosting with the same precision she used when reviewing contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars, as if even this moment deserved control. She did not wipe it away completely, only enough to clear her vision. Her eyes, steady and unshaken, lifted toward the far end of the table where Richard Caldwell sat, still relaxed, still entertained, still convinced this was a room he understood. Ava's gaze did not challenge him. It measured him. The servers along the wall had gone still, trays balanced in quiet suspension, trained to disappear but unable to look away. One of them shifted slightly, the faint sound of a shoe against marble echoing louder than it should have. Ava noticed. She always noticed. It was a habit formed years ago, back when rooms like this were not invitations but boundaries, when she stood on the other side of glass doors with a name badge that no one bothered to read, when laughter like this did not follow her but happen around her, as if she were not there at all. She could still remember the scent of industrial cleaner on her mother's hands after long shifts, The way those hands would tremble slightly from exhaustion, but never from fear. The quiet lessons spoken without words. Stand straight, speak carefully, and never let anyone decide your worth before you do. Ava's fingers lowered from her face, leaving behind only a faint trace of white against her skin. Almost deliberate now, almost symbolic. Across the table, Ethan had already moved on, reaching for his phone, scrolling, bored with the moment he had created. To him, it was already over. To the room, it was something to forget. But to Ava, it was data, information, a clear, undeniable picture of who these people were when they believed no consequences existed. She took a single breath, slow and even, her shoulders rising just slightly before settling back into place. The contract folder in front of her remained closed, its dark leather surface catching the soft glow of the chandelier above, untouched, waiting. A few guests began to shift in their seats, sensing something changing, though they could not yet name it. Margaret Caldwell's smile faltered for the briefest second as her eyes flicked toward Ava, then toward her husband, searching for reassurance that everything was still under control. Richard gave none. He simply watched, curiosity beginning to replace amusement, as if he were trying to understand why the woman at the center of his table had not reacted the way he expected. Ava tilted her head ever so slightly, her gaze moving from one face to another, not seeking approval, not seeking apology, only observing. Because in rooms like this, power did not always announce itself. Sometimes it waited, sometimes it listened, and sometimes it allowed just enough silence for the truth to reveal itself without a single word being spoken. Richard Caldwell set his glass down with a soft, deliberate click against the table, the kind of small sound that carried more weight than it should, because in rooms like this, attention followed habit, and habit followed him. "All right," he said, his tone smooth, controlled, as if nothing unusual had happened, as if the moment from second ago had already been categorized and dismissed. "Let's get back to why we are here." A few of the guests nodded almost immediately, relieved by the cue, their bodies leaning forward again, their smiles returning in careful, practiced shapes. The rhythm of the evening attempted to reset itself. Silverware shifted. A server stepped forward cautiously to refill a glass, the faint pour of liquid threading through the air like a signal that normalcy had resumed. Ava Brooks did not sit. Her chair remained slightly pulled back, untouched, as if she had never intended to fully settle into it. The contract folder in front of her still lay closed, its edges perfectly aligned with the table, untouched by the hands that were expected to open it. Richard noticed that now. His eyes flicked down to it, then back up to her, a subtle crease forming between his brows, not yet concern, but no longer indifference. "Miss Brooks," he continued, his voice carrying just enough authority to remind the room who he believed himself to be, "we are all very eager to finalize this partnership tonight." The word partnership lingered in the air, polished and intentional, as if it could smooth over anything that came before it. Ava's gaze shifted to him again, steady, unhurried, as though she had all the time in the world, as though time itself had adjusted to her pace rather than the other way around. She reached for the linen napkin beside her plate, lifting it with calm precision, and this time she wiped the remaining trace of frosting from her cheek. The fabric absorbed it silently, leaving her skin clean, composed, untouched by what had happened just moments earlier. She folded the napkin once, neatly, and placed it beside the untouched silverware. No ruse, no emotion, just completion. Around the table, a few guests exchanged glances, something unspoken passing between them, a quiet recognition that the balance of the room had not returned to what it was. Ethan barely looked up, still absorbed in the glow of his phone screen, the faint reflection of it flickering across his face, disconnected from the subtle shift unfolding just feet away. Margaret straightened slightly in her chair, her smile now thinner, her fingers tightening around the stem of her glass. Richard leaned back just enough to study Ava more closely, his confidence still intact, but now edged with curiosity, the kind that appeared when expectations began to slip. "Shall we proceed?" he asked, gesturing lightly toward the folder, toward the deal, toward the outcome he had already imagined. Ava's hand moved then, finally reaching for the contract, but instead of opening it, she rested her palm flat against the cover, feeling its weight, its texture, the quiet significance it held in that moment. Her eyes did not leave his. The room held its breath without realizing it, the soft hum of conversation fading into something thinner, something fragile. Because beneath the polished surface, beneath the practiced smiles and measured voices, something had shifted, and even those who could not name it could feel it, like a change in pressure before a storm, subtle but undeniable, waiting for the moment it would finally break. The pressure in the room tightened, subtle but unmistakable, like a thread pulled just enough to make everything else shift with it. Ava Brooks kept her hand resting on the contract, her fingers spread lightly across the leather surface, feeling the quiet authority beneath it, not as something to display, but something to control. She tilted her head slightly, her gaze still locked on Richard Caldwell, and when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, even carrying just enough to reach every corner of the room without effort. "Tell me something," she said, her tone measured, almost conversational, as if they were discussing something far less consequential than what sat between them. "Is this how your family treats people you expect to trust you with their future?" The question did not land like an accusation. It landed like a mirror. A few guests shifted in their seats, their expressions tightening as the words settled in, heavier than anyone expected. Margaret's fingers stilled around her glass. Ethan glanced up briefly, just long enough to register that the attention had returned to the woman he had already dismissed, then looked back down again, unaware of what was unfolding. Richard did not answer immediately. His jaw moved slightly, a subtle adjustment, as if recalibrating, as if deciding which version of himself this moment required. "You are taking this too seriously," he said finally, a faint smile returning, though it no longer reached his eyes. "It was harmless. We are all here in good spirit." Ava listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, her posture unwavering. She did not nod. She did not argue. She simply let the words exist, let them hang in the space between them, and in that space something began to fracture, not loudly, not visibly, but in the quiet way assumptions break when they are no longer supported. She lifted her hand from the contract, not opening it, not yet, and instead turned it slightly, aligning it more precisely with the edge of the table, a small, deliberate movement that drew the eye without demanding it. The room followed without realizing. "What? Good spirit," she repeated softly, as if testing the weight of the phrase. Her gaze moved across the table again, slower this time, pausing just long enough on each face to make them aware of being seen, truly seen, not as guests or allies, but as participants in something they had not fully understood until now. A man near the far end cleared his throat quietly. Another shifted his chair back an inch, the soft scrape against marble louder than intended. The servers remained still, their presence fading into the walls, yet somehow more present than anyone else in the room. Ava's eyes returned to Richard. There was no anger in them. That was what unsettled him most. No reaction he could dismiss. No emotion he could control. Just clarity. "I see," she said, almost to herself, though the room heard it. Then, slowly, she slid the contract a few inches forward, not toward herself, but toward the center of the table, placing it exactly where everyone could see it, where its importance could no longer be ignored or assumed. Her fingers lingered on the edge for a brief second before releasing it completely. And in that small, controlled motion, the balance of the room shifted again, more noticeably this time, like something unseen had finally crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, leaving behind a silence that was no longer comfortable, no longer polite, but charged with the quiet understanding that whatever came next would not follow the script anyone here had expected. No one reached for the contract. It sat there in the center of the table, quiet and unclaimed, yet somehow louder than anything that had been said all night. Richard Caldwell's eyes dropped to it again, then lifted back to Ava Brooks, and this time there was no mistaking the shift. The confidence was still there, but it had narrowed, tightened, like a door that had not fully closed. "You are making this unnecessarily complicated," he said, his voice firmer now, less polished, as if control required a little more effort than before. "We are offering a partnership that benefits everyone in this room." Ava did not respond immediately. She let the words settle, let them repeat themselves in the silence, until even the people who agreed with him began to hear the imbalance inside them. Around the table, a few guests nodded out, of habit, but the movement lacked conviction, their eyes drifting back toward Ava as if waiting for something they could not quite name. Margaret leaned slightly toward her husband, her voice low but not low enough. "Richard," she murmured, a quiet warning wrapped in concern, but he did not look at her. His focus remained fixed on Ava, as though acknowledging anything else might mean losing ground. Ethan finally looked up again, this time with a flicker of irritation, sensing the attention had not moved on as expected. "Are we really still talking about this?" he said, his tone dismissive, his fingers tapping lightly against the edge of his phone. It was a joke. The word joke lingered again, thinner this time, less certain, as if even it no longer believed itself. Ava's gaze shifted toward him for the first time since the moment had begun, and the room followed, every eye tracing the same line of attention. She did not speak to him directly. She did not correct him. She simply looked, steady and unblinking, long enough for the silence to stretch, long enough for his confidence to falter just a fraction, though he could not explain why. Then her eyes moved back to Richard, returning the focus to where it belonged. "A partnership," she said softly, repeating his earlier word, but now it carried a different weight, stripped of its polish, exposed in its intent. She stepped slightly closer to the table, the faint sound of her heels against marble precise and measured, each step controlled, each movement deliberate. Her hand reached forward again, this time not to rest on the contract, but to slide it back toward herself, slow enough that everyone could see it, slow enough that no one could pretend it did not matter. The leather edge brushed softly against the surface as it moved, a quiet sound that seemed to echo far louder than it should have. Richard's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, his shoulders straightening, his jaw tightening, the first visible sign that something was no longer aligning with his expectations. "Yes," he said, more quickly now, as if speed could restore control. "A very significant one." Ava paused with the contract, now directly in front of her, her fingers resting lightly along its edge. She looked down at it for a brief moment, then back up at him, her expression unchanged, calm, unreadable. "Significant," she repeated, her voice steady, almost thoughtful. Then she lifted the folder slightly, just enough to break contact with the table, just enough to draw every eye back to it, to her, to the moment that had quietly built itself into something no one could reverse. And in that suspended second, before anything was opened, before anything was revealed, the room understood, without anyone saying it out loud, that whatever happened next would not be controlled by the people who had been laughing just minutes ago. The folder hovered in Ava Brooks's hand for a fraction of a second longer, just above the table, just above the line where expectation and reality had quietly separated. Then she lowered it again, not opening it, not yet, placing it back down with the same controlled precision that had defined every movement she had made since the moment began. The soft contact of leather against marble sounded final in a way no one could explain. No one spoke. The room did not simply fall silent this time. It held its breath, as if even the air understood that something irreversible had already begun. Ava did not look at anyone right away. Her gaze dropped instead to the faint smear of frosting that had dried slightly along the edge of the napkin beside her plate, the white now dull under the chandelier light. No longer soft, no longer harmless, just a quiet mark of what had been allowed to happen. She reached for the glass of water in front of her, lifting it slowly, the condensation leaving a faint ring on the table as it rose. She did not drink immediately. She held it there for a moment, watching the way the light bent through the clear liquid, the way something so simple could distort what lay behind it. Then she took a small sip, measured, unhurried, and set the glass back down exactly where it had been. The faint sound echoed again, precise, intentional. Across from her, Richard Caldwell shifted in his seat, the movement subtle but no longer invisible. His fingers tapped once against the table, then stopped, as if even that small loss of control had registered. Margaret's posture had changed entirely now, her shoulders drawn in slightly, her earlier composure replaced with something more cautious, more aware. She glanced at Ava, then at the contract, then back at her husband, searching for a signal that had not come. Ethan leaned back again, though this time the movement lacked the same ease, his attention flickering between his phone and the room, sensing the shift without understanding it. Ava finally lifted her eyes again, not sharply, not dramatically, just enough to re-enter the room fully, and when she did, the space seemed to adjust around her, as if her presence had weight that could not be ignored any longer. She did not speak. Not yet. Instead, she let the silence do what it had been building toward, stretching it just far enough that it became uncomfortable, just far enough that every person at the table became aware of their own stillness, their own participation in the moment that had led them here. A man near the far end cleared his throat again, softer this time, almost apologetic. A server shifted their grip on a tray, the faint clink of glass against glass breaking and then disappearing into the stillness. Ava's hand moved once more, this time resting lightly on the contract again, but not to claim it, not to open it, just to acknowledge it, to anchor the moment to something real, something tangible. Her fingers pressed slightly against the surface, then relaxed, as if reminding herself that control did not need to be shown, only held. The city lights beyond the glass windows flickered in the distance, thousands of small points glowing against the night, indifferent to what was happening 30 floors above, and yet somehow mirroring it, each light a quiet reminder of how many unseen stories existed beyond this room. Ava took another breath, slow and steady, her shoulders rising and falling in a rhythm that belonged only to her, untouched by the tension around her. And in that breath, in that stillness, in that carefully held pause, the moment reached its edge, the exact point where silence could no longer contain what had been building, where something had to be said, where truth, once delayed, would finally step forward. "I think we have been discussing the wrong thing," Ava Brooks said quietly, and her voice did not rise. Yet carried further than anything else that had been spoken that night, cutting cleanly through the fragile silence that had settled over the table. No one interrupted. No one laughed this time. Richard Caldwell's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in recalculation, as if he were finally beginning to understand that the conversation had shifted beyond his control. Ava's fingers moved across the surface of the contract, not opening it yet, just tracing the edge with calm precision before she lifted it fully into her hands. The movement drew every gaze in the room without effort. "You keep calling this a partnership," she continued, her tone steady, measured, each word placed with intention. "But a partnership assumes mutual respect." The word respect lingered, heavier than before, no longer abstract, now anchored to what had already happened. Margaret's breath caught softly, almost inaudible, but enough to reveal the crack forming beneath her composure. Ethan shifted in his seat, his earlier confidence dissolving into something less certain, his phone now forgotten in his hand. Ava opened the folder then, not dramatically, just enough to reveal the neatly organized pages inside, the signatures waiting, the numbers aligned in clean, unforgiving rows. The soft rustle of paper echoed louder than it should have. She did not look down at them. She already knew what they said. Instead, she looked directly at Richard. "Do you know what this is?" she asked, though the answer was obvious. He straightened slightly. "Of course I do," he replied, but the certainty in his voice had thinned, stretched too far. Ava nodded once, a small acknowledgement, then turned the folder slightly, so it faced him more clearly, though she still held it. "This is not an opportunity you are giving me," she said. "This is a decision I am making." The distinction landed with quiet force, not loud, not aggressive, but undeniable. A man near the end of the table leaned forward slightly, his expression shifting from curiosity to realization. Margaret's hand tightened around her glass again, but this time she did not raise it. Richard's jaw set, his posture rigid now, the first real sign that the balance had moved beyond recovery. "Miss Brooks," he began, his voice lower, more controlled, "I think there has been a misunderstanding." Ava tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady, unflinching. "No," she said softly, "I do not think there has." She let the silence return for a brief moment, just long enough for the weight of her words to settle fully, just long enough for every person in the room to feel the shift that had already taken place. Then she closed the folder again, the sound quiet but final, and placed it back down on the table, directly in front of her, her hand resting lightly on top of it. "I'm the one who decides whether this deal moves forward," she said, her voice calm, clear, leaving no space for interpretation. And in that instant, the room did not just fall silent. It froze. Every expression, every movement, every assumption held in place by the sudden, undeniable truth that the power they thought they understood had never belonged to them at all. The silence did not break immediately. It fractured slowly, like glass under pressure, each second stretching longer than the last as the weight of Ava Brooks's words settled into every corner of the room. Richard Caldwell did not move at first, but his expression changed in a way he could not fully control. The certainty that had defined him all evening now replaced by something sharper, something closer to awareness. "If that is the case," he said carefully, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier ease, "then perhaps we should reset the tone of this conversation." The choice of words was deliberate, an attempt to reclaim ground without acknowledging what had been lost. Margaret leaned forward slightly, her posture softening, her voice following quickly behind his. "Ava," she said, using her first name now, the formality gone, replaced with something more personal, more careful. "What happened earlier was inappropriate. We apologize." The word apology entered the room quietly, almost uncertain of itself, as if it had not been expected to appear at all. Ava did not respond immediately. Her gaze shifted to Margaret, steady, observing, not dismissive, not accepting, simply present. Ethan shifted in his chair again, his earlier confidence gone entirely now, replaced with discomfort he did not know how to mask. He opened his mouth slightly, as if to speak, then stopped, his eyes flicking between his parents and Ava, searching for direction that no longer came easily. Richard exhaled slowly, leaning forward just enough to place both hands on the table, grounding himself in the moment. "We value this deal," he continued, his tone measured, controlled, but no longer dominant. "And we value you." Clearly, there's been a lapse in judgment. The phrase hung in the air, carefully constructed, avoiding direct blame while still attempting to acknowledge the situation. Ava listened, her expression unchanged, her hands still resting lightly on the closed contract in front of her. She tilted her head slightly, considering, not their words, but their timing, their intention, the shift that had brought them here. "A lapse," she repeated softly, almost thoughtfully, as if examining the weight of the phrase. Her fingers moved once across the surface of the folder, a small, absent motion that drew the eye again without demanding it. "It is interesting," she continued, her voice calm, even how quickly respect appears when something valuable is at risk. The words did not accuse. They revealed. Margaret's eyes lowered briefly, her grip tightening around the stem of her glass before she set it down entirely. Richard's jaw shifted again, but he did not interrupt. This time he listened. Ava let the silence return once more, but it was different now. No longer empty, no longer uncertain, but filled with understanding that could not be undone. She lifted her hand from the contract and rested at her side, her posture still composed, still grounded, still entirely her own. "You are not apologizing for what happened," she said quietly. "You are apologizing because you now understand who I am." The truth landed without force, yet it carried more impact than anything that had come before it. Ethan looked down at the table, The reflection of the chandelier flickering across the polished surface, no longer able to meet her gaze. No one corrected her. No one denied it. Because in that moment, there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to redefine. Only the reality of what had already been shown, laid bare in a room that had finally stopped pretending it was something else. No one spoke after that. The words had already done what they needed to do, settling into the room like something permanent, something that could not be rephrased or undone. Ava Brooks stood there for a moment longer, her posture steady, her presence no longer questioned, no longer overlooked. Then, without urgency, without hesitation, she reached for the contract one final time. Her fingers closed around it with quiet certainty, and instead of opening it, instead of offering another explanation or invitation, she simply held it, feeling its weight, acknowledging what it represented and what it no longer would. Richard Caldwell watched her closely now, not with authority, not with confidence, but with the awareness of someone who had just realized the outcome was no longer his to shape. "We can fix this," he said, his voice lower, stripped of everything it had carried before, the words sounding less like a statement and more like a request. Ava looked at him, her expression calm, not unkind, but clear in a way that left no space for misinterpretation. "This was never about fixing," she said quietly. "It was about understanding." The distinction settled between them, final and unmoving. Margaret lowered her gaze, her earlier composure replaced with silence that spoke more than any apology could. Ethan remained still, his phone forgotten entirely now, his reflection faintly visible in the polished surface of the table, a version of himself he did not recognize in this moment. Ava shifted her grip on the contract, then slowly, deliberately, she closed it completely and turned it slightly, aligning it once more with the edge of the table. For a brief second, her hand rested on top of it, the same way it had before, but this time there was no hesitation behind the gesture, no pause waiting for possibility. Then she lifted it and stepped back from the table. The sound of her heels against the marble floor was soft, measured, each step carrying its own quiet authority as she moved away from the center of the room. No one tried to stop her. No one spoke. The chandeliers above continued to cast their warm light across the table, across the untouched glasses, across the faint ring left behind by her water glass. Small details that remained exactly as they had been, unchanged, even as everything else had shifted. Ava reached the edge of the room and paused for just a moment, not to look back, not to reconsider, but simply to exist outside the space that had tried to define her. The city lights beyond the glass stretched endlessly into the night, steady, indifferent, real. Then she continued forward, the door opening quietly as she approached, closing just as softly behind her. Inside, the room